Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Zachary Ring. I'm with Thea Enterprises. We also have Joe Panetta with us. He'll be presenting today from Breakthrough Lighting. We have about half of our expected attendees, so we all have back-to-back webinars. We're going to give everybody another minute or two to join, and we'll get started. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We do have a large amount of people joining us today, so we're going to ask that everybody stays muted throughout the presentation. And please just enter your questions in the chat window or in the question window, and we'll save a couple minutes at the end for Q&A. So once again, we'll get started in another minute or two here. Thanks. And as we're waiting for everybody, I also want to highlight that we have a handout for you today. It has all of Joe's info on Breakthrough Lighting in the handout section. It's a PDF that you can grab. It just covers some of the services he's able to provide. All right, once again, thank you everybody for attending today. I know a lot of us are stuck at home, but we're all still very busy. And I think this is going to be a very valuable hour of time we're going to spend together. This is part one of a three-part series that focuses on lighting design. Today is going to cover a lot of the basics and a lot of the principles of lighting design. We're going to have a second session where Joe is going to talk about all the different products available through Thea's line card and how to insert them effectively into different applications. So I think that'll be very exciting. So we may not talk about all those specific product lines. I'm sure there's going to be mentions of Ketra and Lutron, DMF, some of these product lines we work with, but stay tuned for part two in this series. We're going to take a deeper dive. And then part three in this series, we're going to talk about how to sell and how to build specification business and how to navigate that channel correctly. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Joe Panetta from Breakthrough Lighting. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you, Zach, and welcome everybody. And let me just reiterate how appreciative we are that you've taken time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. So we'll go ahead and get started. So the purpose of today's presentation is to talk a little bit about architectural recessed lighting for the home. So this is going to be primarily focused on the residential side of things. And we're going to try to demystify for you some of the complexity out of working with architectural recessed lighting. So here's the course objectives for today. We're going to spend about 45-50 minutes together. We're going to learn general principles of lighting. We're going to take you into the mind of a specifier, a lighting designer, and even an architect, an interior designer, and the type of things that they pay attention to and the things that they look at. We're going to gain an understanding of how architectural recessed downlights distinguish an interior and the impact that it can have. Learn the basic characteristics of a lighting fixture. We're going to talk in general terms. Like Zach said, we're going to have another presentation where we're going to become a little more product specific for you. And of course, we're going to try to simplify this on point number 4, demystify all the complexity for you out of it. So when a lighting designer or an interior designer is looking at a project, these are some of the things that they're thinking about in order to design the best space in terms of intent of the design, right? So we're looking at things like space as a foundation. What is the space? How is it going to be utilized? How often are people going to be spending time in there? We're looking at the lines, the shape. Is Is there a lot of curved walls, for instance? Is it more of a square or rectangular space? The forms, in terms of how we're going to be able to highlight specific areas within that space. Colors are very important, not just the color of the ceiling and the walls, but the colors established by the light and the colors that are going to be reflected off of other surfaces like floors and furniture and tables and so forth. Texture, as you know, many of your clients probably spend a lot of money on paintings and statues and things of that nature, or materials, and we want to be able to highlight those things properly so that they can enjoy them and see them as they were meant to be seen. And that sort of goes along with that pattern as well. So the bottom line is that lighting is very important, contrary to rumors that you may have heard. Without it, other design elements do not have significance. And that statement could be a little bit biased. It may not, I don't know. So principles of lighting, right? So in terms of visibility, how clearly people see things depends on the lighting. So lighting, the brighter it is, the more focus it brings to certain subjects. But bright isn't always the answer. You have to have a combination of other things that you have to do in the background. So hierarchy of visual importance is taken into consideration, right? We want to know what areas are going to be emphasized a little more prominently than others. Some will be in the background, some will be brought to the forefront, and vice versa. And maybe you want to have the flexibility to do both at the same time or at different times. So hierarchy is important. And then contrast ratios, so that you can show the texture and the characteristics of the room and bring more personality to it. The modeling of the texture is also important, again, because of the fact that many of your clients are going to be very particular about the types of materials that they choose, the building materials, and they want all those things to be highlighted. And of course, space perception. Lighting can make a place look bigger. It could make it look smaller, cramped, confined, or it could make it feel comfortable and where there's a lot of space to do the things that you want to do. So space perception is very important. And then color perception, setting the mood for how things are going to feel, and obviously highlighting the different characteristics of whatever it is that is being illuminated within a space. So these are the things that we pay attention. These are the things that go into consideration. And so if you're talking to a specifier and they're bugging you and asking you a whole bunch of questions, and you don't understand why they want to be so detailed, these are some of the reasons why that is. So here's a good example of how light is utilized to create all these different layers. And as you can see here, those pendants are being used as general ambient lighting, just lighting up the entire space so that people can see where they're walking, so they don't bump into furniture, those type of things, right? And then you have task lighting, and that is being delivered by the downlights in this particular case. They're fixed, they have a specific beam optic, and they're illuminating a specific area. And that could be an area where a lot of things are done repeatedly, like cutting vegetables, like, you know, preparing food before it's put into the stove, those type of things. You want to see at all times what it is that you're doing, and you want to be able to see that clearly. And then accent lighting would be in the background, under cabinet lighting. You see the two little puck lights over the stove. That would be an example of accent lighting. Coves around the perimeter of a room would be another example. But this is the concept of layering with light and highlighting and emphasizing different things within a space. So some of the tricks and techniques that are used, there's different types of lighting. It's good to familiarize yourself with these terms. If you're talking to a specifier, if you're talking to me and we're working together, I'll forgive you. But other specifiers are very sticky about these points and using the right terminology. So I just want to make sure you understand that. So going from top to bottom and left to right here, downlights is pretty obvious, right? Pretty self-explanatory. You're just illuminating whatever is under the fixture. Uplighting, it's another technique that is used more often in commercial spaces, but sometimes it could be used in residential spaces, and that is the ability to shine the light upwards and have it bounce off the ceiling and create an ambience directly below. Cove lighting, I just mentioned it, good for accents, illuminating perimeters of a specific space. Then you have wall washing. A few things to keep in mind where you're working with wall washing is their purpose and the right technique in terms of installation, right? So a wall wash will typically flatten the surface that it's illuminating. So if you have something that has a lot of texture, it's going to flatten that texture when it's illuminated, right? Unlike the wall grazing, which we're going to get into in a second. So if you have a situation where the texture or the color is important, you may not want to use a wall washer. But if it's art and you're just trying to highlight the beauty and the colors, wall washing might be the right option. The other thing you want to consider about wall washing is the separation in the distance from the wall, because the ultimate purpose is to have as much of an even illumination from the top down as you possibly can. So rule of thumb, you're always going to be somewhere possibly between 2 feet to 3 feet, depending on the beam angle of the wall washer itself, and also depending on the height of the ceiling. So those things will have to be taken into consideration, and you can consult with a professional like myself, or even look at the spec sheet. Sometimes they'll provide some guidelines for that. Front lighting, very self-explanatory. There are some situations where front lighting will be appropriate. And then we get to wall grazing, right? And wall grazing is where you're definitely bringing the texture or the characteristics and the quality of the surface into view and highlighting that. So if you have just a flat wall with drywall, and the drywaller didn't do a very good job in terms of finishing that, you know, like a level 5 finish or something like that, and there's a lot of bumps and imperfections, well, the wall grazing is just going to make those imperfections more obvious. But if you have a beautiful brick wall, or if you have a texture wall with wood finish or something like that, and you want to highlight the characteristics and the personality, then definitely wall grazing will do that for you. And then of course you have backlighting. This could come in the form of LED strips. It could come in the form of backlit panels and so forth. These are good for bar areas, bookshelves, you know, wine cellars, or other areas where you want to be able to highlight the space from a different angle or from a different perspective. So these are some of the techniques that are used. So let's jump into why recessed lighting is such a phenomenal way of just bringing just about every kind of solution.
And we're going to do a quick poll here really quick too, just to try to engage everybody. So there's no wrong answers. This is more of an opinion, but why do you think recessed lighting is one of the most powerful tools in lighting design? And you can select multiple answers. So if everybody just wants to go ahead and submit their answer here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and let's just take a look at the results.
All right, the suspense was killing me, Zach. So very good. Let's keep that up there for a second. And what I'd like everybody to see where you and your peers are in terms of your priorities and what you view as important. Minimally intrusive as part of architecture, great. It's a very popular answer, and definitely something that we're going to cover. Wide range of options to layer lighting, very good. Universal and timeless aesthetic, okay, great. And works well with LEDs, directional nature. Very high percentages on all of them. So we'll definitely be covering all of these things. So sit back and we'll continue with the presentation. So again, when you're considering recessed lighting, right, and you ask the question, well, why would we want to put recessed lighting instead of a bunch of rope lights or a bunch of pendants all over the place. You want to consider the architectural component of it, which we'll talk about. Which platform, and what we mean by that is because there's a myriad of options, right? There's adjustables, there's fixed, there's different beam optics, different size of housing, different types of trims and finishes. So all of those things have to be taken into consideration. Which specific attributes in terms of aesthetics and so on, and how many and where to place them. So these are the questions that we would be asking anytime we're considering architectural recessed lights, right? So overall, recessed lighting is one of the most powerful tools that you can use because it's probably one of the most versatile in terms of effect. Less intrusive, obviously, because it's recessed. It can be flexible because there's a different types of platforms that you can use and how to utilize them. Wide range of options to layer lighting. You can use them to pretty much address just about every principle and every technique that we previously discussed in the other slides. Universal aesthetic, works well with LEDs, directional nature. Works well with LEDs, directional nature, just so that you know, in general, an LED, when a solid state diode emits light, it doesn't have direction. It just lights up and it goes into all these different places. Typically it's about 120 degrees, so it's a very wide angle. So optics are designed to give that brightness direction, right? To give that beam some direction and manipulate it. And so this is why you have to have those optics. High potential for zonal control. Everybody knows that you can create scenes, especially if you have warm dim, or if you have tunable white lights. It's a great way to create moods and change scenes between zones, between different places in the space that you're trying to light up. So very, very versatile, very universal overall. This is why recessed lighting is so important. But then we have to keep in mind that architectural recessed lighting is not all created equal. As we just spoke, there's different platforms that we can use, right? Just like a refrigerator, a stove, a faucet, a toilet is not the same, and different features are emphasized depending on the specialty of the manufacturer or what the manufacturer's core competence or core technologies are. Some have patents, so they emphasize the technologies or the features that go with their patents. Others decide to keep things a little more simple. And then you have some manufacturers who try to be all things to all people. So there's going to be a different range, but just keeping in mind that just like you can upgrade a stove and just like you can upgrade a refrigerator, you can upgrade your recessed lights. So what makes recessed lights architectural, right? Why the term architectural? Well, number one is because it allows you to do different things with them, right? And the way that it integrates with the rest of the structure. So you have multiple applications that as we briefly mentioned. You have adjustable, you have downlights, you have wall washes, and you can add multiple layers and have them all be in the same room, working in unison, serving different purposes in the same ceiling surface area. You have quiet ceiling, which is the ability to illuminate a space without calling attention to the light source itself. That is probably one of the most important characteristics that you're going to hear about. And judging from the answers to the first poll question, it's a very important point to you guys as well, right? And another way to refer to quiet ceiling would be mud in, right? This is the mud in type of fixture that doesn't break the plane of the ceiling or the transition between space and surface. There's multiple installation options. You can go with new construction, remodel, insulated. For insulated ceilings, Chicago Plenum, which is specific to Chicago. This was something that was put in place way back in the day because of the fires that they had there many decades ago. So they put more strict criteria for the lights. You have shallow plenum This is true in the case of multiple apartment units where the overhead space of the ceiling may be very shallow, and you may require to have a fixture that doesn't take a lot of space. And of course, wood ceilings, a little more tricky, more difficult to work with, but there's definitely ways to address that as well. And of course, you have multiple aesthetic options. You have aperture sizes. We got here 2, 3, 4 inch, but we know that they can go much bigger than that in some cases if the application calls for it, or even a little bit smaller than that. And of course, with regards to trims, there's a myriad of options of trims, right? You have square trims, round trims, flange, flangeless, bevels, all kinds of different options, and finishes and colors as well. And of course, we have multiple performance options. This has to do a little bit more with the beam spread, the way that the beam or the light behaves in the space. Lumen output would be the intensity of brightness of the light, and color temperatures would address the color spectrum, going from very, very warm, which would be more of a yellow light, to very, very cool, which would be more of a clear, almost glacier blue type of light on the other spectrum. All of that measured by kelvins. You may have heard of, obviously, 2700K, 3000K. That refers to the CCT or the color temperature. And of course, craftsmanship goes into play, and we're going to get a little more detail as far as what all of that entails. But the ability to have these lights and have them last for a long, long time, and still continue to be relevant for that space, that's very attractive as well. It's a good return on investment for the owner. So all these things are things that, you know, we don't need to remember every specific detail, but in a flash, in a second, when we think of architectural lighting, these would be the things that just scroll through our minds when we're thinking about using them. So let's talk a little bit about quiet ceiling and explain that, since this happens to be one of the topics that's of most important, right? What does it mean? And how does it work? Well, like we said, it's basically the ability to have a light that doesn't draw any attention to the light source, but it allows you to just experience and bring feeling and drama to what it is that it's being utilized for, right? So it creates an emotional mood without drawing eye towards the ceiling, doesn't break the ceiling plane, reduces flash or unwanted reflected light, reduces glare or direct visibility. Some people are extremely sensitive to glare for medical reasons or for just as a matter of preference. So that's one thing that you want to pay attention to, and improves the visual comfort while performing specific tasks. So one of the things to keep in mind when it comes to recessed lights on the quiet ceiling or the mud-in is the ability for the light, the lamp itself, the light engine, to be able to recess up and down, right? If you have a light that's able to recess up, you're going to get more of that reduction of glare. Or if you have a light that comes down right down to the aperture or the opening, you're going to get more lumen output, but there's going to be a little more glare. So there's some trade-offs in your selection of a quiet ceiling light. The other thing to keep in mind is the size of the housing, and we'll get into that a little bit, but some are very restrictive as far as how much you can recess the light engine, and others are not. So there's some trade-offs that you have to keep in mind when you're selecting your light, and that's why we're going to get into the specifics and break down all the different components and characteristics of each platform. So right on cue, selecting the right platform, right? So what is it that we're trying to accomplish? Are we just looking to provide general lighting in a storage space like a laundry room or a closet? Or are we trying to highlight art or texture or specific areas of the house or characteristics? Or are we trying to get some flexibility for the future because we don't know exactly how the furniture is going to be laid out and all that? So these three types of lights address all of those things. Let's start with the adjustable, right? So the adjustable can be aimed in just about any direction. Most lights give you that flexibility. We have a slide here where we look at it a little bit closer. But a typical application would be just again, buying insurance for the future. If the owner doesn't know exactly how the furniture is going to be laid out, if he doesn't know exactly what things he wants to highlight inside a space, or where or how the art is going to be hung on the walls, then an adjustable light will give you the flexibility to be able to adapt to whatever the configuration of the room is later. So it's good for that. And it also has its very own applications, right? If you have a combination of this with other types of lights. But just keep in mind that if you go with all adjustable because you say, oh, that's a no-brainer, we'll just put adjustables everywhere, that it will have an impact on the budget. Adjustable lights, because of all the mechanical and extra components, tend to be higher in cost than a fixed light. The wall wash is very specific. You're gonna use it to illuminate large art or multiple smaller pieces on a wall, on a corner, in hallways, and it will call attention to specific architectural details, right? And keep in mind, this is very important, preferably something that is non-texture, because it will flatten the look of things because of the angle and the nature of how the beam behaves. And then, of course, you have fixed lighting. And fixed lighting, most manufacturers sell different types at different price ranges, and that's a good thing, because while you may want to have a better type of recessed lighting in the dining room where everybody congregates and shares the space and the experience, you may not need to have such a fancy recessed down light when it comes to a laundry room or a technical room. So having the ability to choose between price ranges is a good thing. So the most budget-friendly light will always be the fix, but also keep in mind that there are different levels, right? Just like we talked about those refrigerators and those stoves having different levels, the same thing with the recessed fixed down lights. Not all of them are created equal. Just keep that in mind. So let's talk a little bit more in more detail as far as adjustability and aiming for an adjustable light, since it's so versatile and it could be a very popular choice among all of you. So the vertical tilt, and that is the ability to aim the light on an angle, right? From one angle to the other. You can start with the light just being strictly down, and you can tilt it vertically up to, in some cases, 40 degrees or 45 degrees. So that's very important. People like that because then you can aim it towards the wall, you can aim it towards a corner, you can aim it towards a workspace so that you can use it for task lighting and so on. The second characteristic is the horizontal rotation, right? So you have the ability to tilt it, but then to have the ability to spin it so that tilt can go into any direction, almost like a gyroscope. And so that the horizontal rotation is important for that reason. Now, again, keep in mind that not all are created equal, and the mechanisms are different for different lights. So you have to pay attention to the ability of the light to recess inwards towards the housing, to be able to bring it down, whether you can spin it 360, 365 degrees, and then the angle will also be very important, because the wider the angle, right? 45 degrees being the maximum in most cases, the more flexibility you have as to where you want to aim it. And those are the characteristics of an adjustable light. We just talked about the high-low lamp positioning. And again, keep in mind that you're always making trade-offs in all of this, right? So if you want the light to go into the fixture a little bit more because you don't want the glare, keep in mind that you're going to reduce the brightness. So you're going to sacrifice lumens. Whereas if you bring it down, you're going to get a little more glare, but you're also going to get more luminance or a little more brightness and intensity out of your light. So these are some of the trade-offs and some of the things you want to be thinking about when you're talking about adjustable. And with the wall wash, we've already mentioned a few things, but again, accent lighting for flat walls. And one of the things that you want to make sure that you're doing is you want to be consistent with your spacing. So important, not just to get the sweet spot in terms of the distance from the wall. And again, that's all dictated by the height of the ceiling and what it is that you're trying to illuminate. And then the degree of the beam will have something to do with that. All of those things have to be taken into consideration. But consistency and spacing between each light, and consistency and spacing distance from the wall. And you may get different effects, right? Like one of the effects, and this is mixed again, is a matter of preference, is the scalloping that's created by multiple wall washes being installed in one space, right? And the scalloping refers to those little shaded areas that sort of highlight the shape of the beam. Some people like them, some people may not like them. So how do you get rid of them if you don't want them there? Well, there's different applications, different elements that you can add to the fixture. One of them is the utilization of lenses, different lenses. For instance, a clear lens will just illuminate and bring the beam out exactly the way it comes out of the optic, and it'll create the scalloping. But if you use a prismatic lens or a frosted lens, which is designed to soften that beam a little bit, and it'll eliminate those harsh scalloping edges that you see there, and it'll just make the ambience or the coverage of the illumination more even and get rid of those all that scalloping. So different things to take into consideration when you're utilizing wall washes. So let's talk about platforms, right? Selecting the right platform and further considerations in terms of how the lights are going to look and the finish. So which aperture are you going to use? Are you going to go with a very small 2-inch, a 3-inch, or 4-inch? Well, that's going to depend on the size of or the height of the ceiling. If it's a very high ceiling, and by that I mean 12 to 14 foot ceilings, and you use a 2-inch downlight, well, it's going to look like a little pinhole because of the height of the ceiling. And then on the other side of the spectrum, if you have an 8-foot ceiling and you go with a whole bunch of 4-inch downlights everywhere, it's going to look like Swiss cheese. There's just going to be holes all over the place. So you have to be able to take those things into consideration. I can tell you that most designers, because most of your ceilings are going to be anywhere between 10 and 12 in most cases, especially for some of the high-end residence work that you guys do, most designers settle on the 3-inch. That's the happy medium in most cases. It gives you a great amount of versatility in terms of the beam optics that you can use, and it doesn't look too big and it doesn't look too small when you have that particular height. But again, some of these things are also preference, and some of them depend on the manufacturer themselves, whether they make, for instance, there's certain manufacturers that make the 4-inch, but they don't make 3-inch. There's some that make 3-inch and 4-inch, but they don't make 2-inch. So if you're going to have different levels of ceiling heights throughout the house, and you want to be consistent, you want to use the same manufacturer because you're worried about compatibility with your control system, and you want to make sure that the same protocol and the same type of drivers for the same manufacturer being used throughout the house, you may want to take into consideration whether the manufacturer has that diverse range of selection with the different aperture heights. Something to keep in mind. So what about the light source, right? Well, in our case, it's a slam dunk. It's already set for us. It's LED. This is the future is here. It's LED, and it's going to be LED all the time going forward for most applications, right? Especially if you want the level of control and the dimming and the color temperature change and all those things, you're going to go with LED. I'm a little traumatized when I talk about this thing, so bear with me because of the fact that I also have operations in California, and in California we have the Title 24, which is very strict about efficacy, and it deals with using strictly LED lights. I think something very similar is coming to New York. Some of those same laws are going to be implemented there, and in other parts of the country they're toying with the idea of doing that. So you definitely want to pay attention to LED, and you want to become familiarized with the technology. So LED will give you the ability and the range to be able to match halogen. It's not apples and apples. Halogen does happen to have a warmer feel to it that LED sometimes has difficulty matching, but some advanced technologies like Ketra, for instance, do an extremely good job, a phenomenal job in terms of matching that same feel when implemented correctly. All right, so that's part of the platform. Let's talk now a little bit more about the housing and the type of construction it is. So obviously different manufacturers will have a different type of housing depending on what the application is. So if the ceiling is open, then you have to use the housing for new construction, as you see in the picture there. All right, that's just one example. As I mentioned, we're going to get very product specific in the second part of this series, and we'll talk a lot more about the products that you're familiar with and that you use. And then for remodel, it's less restricted in terms of size. It's a little more flexible, and that's usually called for when you just have to open a hole in the ceiling and insert into an existing structure already. The other thing is you want to make sure that you get the rating correctly, IC rated. And IC stands for insulation contact. And what that basically means is that if the insulation is going to be 3 inches away from the light, you're going to have this IC housing. It's going to have to be IC rated in all cases because of fire hazards. Now, LED technology as it is, those LEDs stay pretty cool. They don't really, I mean, they're just warm to the touch. But every once in a while, if something doesn't get wired properly, whether it is the line voltage that's coming into the fixture, or sometimes even within the housing itself, the relationship of the light engine to the driver being not having the right context, it could get a little warm in there. So just to avoid any hazards, you have to have that housing. And then the other thing you have to take into consideration is the plenum, right? The plenum is the space between the ceiling and the floorboard on the other side, or the top of the house. So how much space do you have there? Again, we spoke a little while ago about multi-home units, right? Or apartment buildings where the space could be a little more restrictive. So then you may have to choose a housing that it's a little bit narrower or a little bit shorter than your typical housing. And again, some manufacturers make the shorter ones, some don't. So you have to be familiar with what the manufacturer that you're dealing with is able to produce for you. And again, as I said before, there are trade-offs in performance, right? There are trade-offs in, for instance, the one on this little housing here, there's only 2 inches tall. The shorter one, obviously you wouldn't be able to recess that light, so that you're going to create more glare. That's one of the trade-offs that you have to make when you use that. But if that's what the space calls for, then those things have to be explained to the owner, to the architect, to the interior designer, so that everybody's on the same page. Here is an example of that housing and its purpose with relation to the insulation. And again, you just want to make sure that that insulation is at least 3 inches away from the housing or from the light source. And in most cases, you know, most manufacturers, even if it doesn't have a housing, they'll have some type of protection around the light to make sure that there's no hazards if it comes in contact with the insulation. But again, you do have to check with your manufacturer and be familiar with this term. And I believe we're coming up to another poll question. So Zach, if you could do us the favor of putting it up there. Which attribute is most important to you when specifying downlight? So let's take a moment to look at the options there and let's get some answers. It'd be great if we had the Jeopardy music, right? Well, you guys are making your selection, but we don't. Maybe by the next one, Zach, we'll have some Jeopardy music.
Okay, I'll work on that.
All right, let's take a look. All right, square versus round, excellent. Flange versus flangeless, number 2, very good. Lumen output, obviously very important. CCT, color correlation, that's the 1800 Kelvin, 2700 Kelvin, all of that in the CRI. Okay, so fortunately for you, we're going to cover all of those things. So we're going to go ahead and move on and continue with that, right? So I'm sure all of you at one point or another have probably glanced or examined very closely a spec sheet, and you've probably seen all the different variations of options and things that are offered inside a spec light or a recessed light to configure it. And I just want to tell you that yes, there's a lot of choices, but once you know what you're looking at, it's not as complicated as it seems. But I will tell you that each one of those choices is extremely important for you to get right. So you have to pay attention when you're building your part number before you order it. Why do I say this? Well, some of these lights are very expensive. They're made to order. You don't have manufacturers keeping a whole bunch of expensive lights on the shelf in inventory, because those are resources and cash that is being tied up, right? So they have the components, and when you place the order, they assemble the lights and they send them to you. This is why sometimes you'll get a 2-week lead time, a 4-week lead time, a 6-week lead time, depending on the complexity and depending on the demand of the product, right? So if you have an 8-week lead time and you assemble a line of characters to put a part number together, and you weren't paying attention and you got a couple of those wrongs, and 8 weeks pass and the product shows up at the job site and it's not the right color temperature, or it's not the right beam optic, or there was something else about the housing itself that wasn't right, then potentially you could be waiting another 6 or 8 weeks for another batch of lights to come in. And something that I didn't mention in the other presentation, and I'll mention it to you guys, is manufacturers do not like product to be returned, and they usually have some very, very hefty restocking fees. And I'm talking to the tune of 40 to 50% in some cases. So very important to familiarize yourself with what all these numbers mean. If you happen to be one of the people that are going to be recommending the lights or speccing the lights, we want to make sure that this is something that we're paying attention to. So once you understand the basic principles, you can dissect the manufacturer's spec sheet. A recessed fixture is typically comprised of 2 components, right? We have the housing and we have the trim. Here's another thing I wanted to tell you about the housing and the trim, is that sometimes they can be ordered separately. You may have a long interval between hanging housings and closing the ceiling and finishing up with the trims. So you have a couple of options. You either order everything together and wait and store the trim somewhere. Some people don't like to do that because sometimes they get lost, they could get damaged, they could get stolen, misplaced, whatever the case is. So they'll just get the housing and later order the trims and the light engine. Some manufacturers only allow you to order the trim and the housing separately. The light engine comes with the housings because of electrical and wiring. So that may be the combination that you're stuck with. In other cases, they may just not allow you to do that and you have to order everything together. So those are some of the things that you have to weigh. The other thing too is that if you happen to order them separately and it happens to be a very technical or a very expensive product, keep in mind that sometimes the demand and the supply kind of go up and down, and you could be stuck with a bunch of housings already hung, and you may get hit with a lead time on the rest of the components. And so it might be good to just order them together. So this is where understanding the logistics of how to order lights comes into play. And whether you're using a distributor like Breakthrough Lighting, for instance, as a distribution component, and we take care of all those things for our clients, but in many cases, you are going to be dealing directly with the manufacturer. And so you're going to have to be able to ask those questions when you are placing your orders to make sure that you're covering all your bases. In the new construction application, the housing must go obviously on before the ceiling is finished, and everything is ordered before the trim as it brings it. The trims can be ordered later, and sometimes people prefer this so it isn't sitting on the job site. So again, these are some of the trade-offs. These are all the things that you have to take into consideration. Let's talk a little bit about aesthetics, right, and finish. This is all about personal preference, and there's different people that influence ultimately what this is going to be. In some cases, the architect will have a lot of influence. In other cases, the interior designer has full control over what happens in terms of finish. And in many cases as well, is the strong preference of the owner, who ultimately is the one that's going to be experiencing and living in this space for a long, long time, right? So to be or not to be, right? Square or round, where do we go with this? Obviously, square can be more unique. It's a little more difficult to install, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Or you can also consider the fact that the trims are also paintable, and you can order them in different custom colors. But let's tackle one at a time. We already discussed the preference factor and who the influencers are, right? Another thing that can dictate the preference is the style of the decor or the style of the architecture that is being implemented and designed, right? A modern house with straight lines, where it's more minimalist, may call for a square light to be more appropriate. And maybe specific areas with a lot of intent for little round lights or something along those lines, round aperture. But if it's a more traditional home, a Victorian style type of house, or a more of a warmth, not so modern or contemporary, round fixtures may be a better choice. And you may get into a situation where the client or your customer is not sure. So you can gauge based on the decor and the style of the architecture, whether, based on what I just said, whether you can recommend a square or a round, right? So let's talk about installation. This is another thing that we need to really consider. Round is pretty straightforward, right? When it comes to lining up, let's say you have a row of round lights in a hallway, and they're spaced about 5 feet apart, no problem, right? You run your string, you run your laser from the center of the light, and you can perfectly match and have a perfectly straight row of lights. But with the square, you're not just worried about the position of the light on the ceiling, but you're also making sure that the edges, because it's a square, the edges of the light line up with the other ones, right? So what do you do in that case? Well, one of the best practices that you can use is you still do the center measurement just like you do on the round, but you do another line for the square side, so that you're lining up both, you're lining up the center and you're lining up your sides. Now, some manufacturers will give you the flexibility that even after the light is installed, you can rotate the trim and just kind of align it in case it comes out of line. But in some cases, some manufacturers, the trim is rigid, it doesn't turn. So if your housing is a little bit skewed, then when you install the trim, that trim is going to be skewed, and it may line up on the center, and you may have a perfectly straight row of lights, but the square they're not going to square up together, right? So you have to take that into consideration. I know a lot of you don't get into installation, but some of you may be subcontracting people to do this for you, or you may have to provide a little bit of support on installation to whoever's doing it, to the contractor that's responsible for it. So just keep that in mind when you're doing that. The other choice here is, do you want it to be flanged or do you want it to be flangeless? Now, flange is pretty self-explanatory, right? It has that little thin ceiling flange or trim around the opening. Now, this is good for different reasons. It's good because the price point is a little bit lower, so it's budget friendly. It's also good because if you have a drywaller that for whatever reason has trouble or gets a little bit sloppy when they're cutting the holes after the ceiling is closed, that flange will allow you to cover some of those imperfections. and it'll be a little forgiving. And then for some people, it's more traditional, so that's the look they prefer, and that's what they want to go with. So again, typically less expensive, a little more flexibility, and also a little bit readily more available because it happens to be one of the more popular options. So manufacturers tend to have those in stock more readily, and lead times will be shorter and all those things. Budget friendly, forgiving, easy to install. In many cases, it's just a matter of twist, pop and twist, or clip it on, and you can walk away from it. You're good with it. All right, but flangeless, which again, if we go back to the first poll question where you guys have a lot of interest, well, this is a different animal, right? Because it is talking about the mud-in fixture, and there's a lot of things that you have to take into consideration, right? Obviously, they're a little more expensive. The degree of difficulty and the labor involved with installing this fixture is much greater, is higher. So whether you have subcontracted a drywaller to do it, or you yourself have drywallers in your crew, just make sure that they're up to speed and that they're able to do this. In some cases, what I recommend is even creating a mock-up and doing a little practice to make sure that you get this right, because the finish has to be perfect, right? So it's more labor intensive. And so in the bidding process, whoever's going to be installing these fixtures, they're going to need to take that into consideration, that there's going to be more labor involved, and therefore you're going to have to charge a little bit more, not just for the fixture itself, but also for the installation. And keep in mind that in most cases, the quality of the trim, the relation of how the trim sits on the ceiling, all of that will have an impact on the finish, right? In most cases, the mud-in trim sits on the drywall itself. So when you are mudding it and you're feathering it out, you're going to have to feather it out at least 18 to 20 inches around the trim itself, because you're trying to minimize. There's going to be a little bit of a hump, a little bit of a grade when you're doing that. And if it's a little bit sloppy or botchy, then when everything is lit up, somebody may be able to notice those imperfections. And you know how it is. Once you notice an imperfection and you walk past that area, that's all you're going to look at every single time you go by that area. So lot to take into consideration when it comes to mud-in fixtures. The other thing that you want to keep in mind too is the access to the light engine itself, right? For, nothing is perfect, and from time to time things are going to be faulty, things are going to go wrong. So you have to take into consideration exactly how are you going to access that light engine, right? If the trim is already mud in, you're not going to go break up the entire drywall just to get the lamp out. So a lot of manufacturers have designed and engineer ease of access into their installation design. So you're going to want to pay attention to that in case you ever have to go in there and replace one of those lamps. With the flange, is a little bit easier because you just pop the trim out, you get to the light source, replace it, and you pop the trim back in. With mud-in, it's a little more delicate, so you have to look out for those pitfalls. Let's talk now about light output. With LED, we talk in terms of lumens. That's how you measure the brightness, the intensity of brightness of a light, not watts. But just a rule of thumb, in most cases, whether you're working with an 8-foot high ceiling or a 12-foot ceiling, in most cases, you're going to be working with lumens in the range of 800 to maybe 1,000, maybe 1,200 lumens in some cases, if they want things to be pop a little bit more and just be a little bit brighter. But rule of thumb, 800 lumens is about the equivalent of a 60-watt light bulb. Except that a light bulb, you can't control the beam and all that. So you get a little bit more out of the 60 watts on an LED than you do out of a typical light bulb. So just keep that in mind when you're explaining it. So they're 85% more energy efficient, a great thing. You can manipulate them more. They offer more flexibility. So keep that in mind as well. And also pay attention to the difference between the lumens that this diode or this light source is able to emit and the deliver number of lumens that it can give you, because those are two different things. You may be specifying a 1000 lumen lamp, but after installation and after you put all your trims and you do all the recess and all that, the deliver amount of lumens could be 800 or 750 lumens. And all of a sudden, you turn the lights on for a walkthrough and the place doesn't look as bright as you were expecting it to look. And the reason for that is because there's two specs in there. There's the actual lumen output and the deliver lumen output. And most manufacturers are very good as far as explaining that and documenting that in their spec sheets, something that you're going to want to keep in mind when you're dealing with downlights, especially in cases where there isn't a lot of natural light coming into the space, not a lot of windows, and you need to rely almost exclusively on the artificial light for illumination. Very important to keep those things in mind. All right. And then after you consider the lumen output, you look at the color temperature, correlated color temperature, and the acronym is CCT. And you know, a picture paints 1,000 words, and I think this picture here in the center is one of the best ways to illustrate to you what that means, right? The lower the Kelvin number, the warmer and the yellowish the light gets. The higher, well, the cooler and the bluer that the light is going to be, kind of like the glacier blue that I was telling you about. 6500K, 7000K, that's usually for operating rooms. Doctors need a lot of clarity when they're opening you up and performing surgery. Those are the types of applications, right? And any place where you're working with heavy machinery and there's a lot of moving parts, you want to have a higher Kelvin. But for a home, typically, in most cases, you're going to be playing in the range of 2700K to 3000K. People that are transitioning from a halogen environment into an LED environment will probably be used to a warmer type of light, and they're going to lean more towards the 2700K color temperature, where if it's just a new construction and it's modern and people are already familiar with the LED concept, you'll probably be more in the 3000K. And in fact, 3000K is sort of becoming the standard for residential these days. Unless people are very specific about it, then they want 2700K. In some cases, when we're evaluating the intent of the design, we may find it as a lighting designer appropriate to have a mix of the two, depending on how the house or the space is going to be utilized and the type of vibe or environment or emotion that you're trying to create within that space. But this is the case. Now, so how do we keep manufacturers honest so that 2700K is 2700K regardless of which manufacturer you go with, right? Because everybody could have their own flavor. So to the right here, we have a graph. It's called a black body curve that is designed to measure the accuracy of color. And all manufacturers are required to test and to make sure that the accuracy of their colors don't fall under a certain standard. Okay, and we're going to go to the next one here to bring it a little bit closer. So manufacturing LEDs is not a 100% precise science. What they usually do is they have these machines that just print a row of LEDs and then they light them up to evaluate the accuracy of the color. And sometimes they'll have some that are good, some are not so good. The ones that are not, they throw out and they recycle them or you know, for materials. And the ones that are good, they keep. They have instruments that test the accuracy of the colors. And that's how they do it. Obviously, the more accurate and the more precise that you want to be, the more of those LEDs you're going to be throwing away because you just want the pure exact color. That is expensive. So the accuracy, in most cases, dictates the cost of the fixture, right? So how do we measure the accuracy? Well, it's done again by using this black body curve. The dots that you see on that graph represent the exact color that you're trying to achieve. Not all LEDs are able to reproduce the exact color. So you measure the closest thing that you can get to it. And the closest you get to it is how close you get to it is measured by these ellipses, this little oval circles that you see there. They're called macadam steps. And you may have heard on the side of a box of a fixture or on the spec sheet, it'll say 2 macadam steps, 3 macadam steps. Well, if it says 3, it means that it's 3 ellipses or 3 little circles away from the true color. Now, fortunately, the eye cannot perceive any difference up to 3 macadam steps. So if you say 2700, but in reality it's about 3 macadam steps or 3 ellipses away from the dot from the center in terms of accuracy, the eye for the most part will not be able to see the difference. But some people might. So it's best to make sure that you're not exceeding that 2 to 3 macadam step in terms of accuracy on the color to get the best result. And that's how we keep manufacturers honest. And it's also important because in some cases you're going to have some very specific applications inside the home. Again, a lot of your customers are going to be investing a lot of money on the finishes, on the floors, the walls, the furniture. We want everything to be lit up as accurately as possible and the colors to be rendered as purely as possible, as they were intended to be experienced, obviously, right? So the process of eliminating the bad ones and keeping the good ones is called binning. And so it's a binning process that manufacturers use to keep quality assurance. And then it's macadam steps that they use to measure the accuracy of the color. Those are the things you need to keep in mind here. So then the other attribute or characteristic is the CRI, the color rendering index. So the CRI is basically the ability of the light to illuminate that color and reflect the same radiance and the same true color that you would have if you took that bowl of strawberries outside into the sunlight at noon when the sun is the brightest and the highest, right? That would be the true color of how that was intended to be experienced. So the higher the CRI, the closer you get to matching the sunlight, the ability of the sunlight to render colors. And again, this is very important because if you have a specific type of shade of red leather on a couch and the customer wants to be able to experience that leather that way in that shade, then you're going to want to pay attention to the CRI to make sure that that is rendered properly, right? So the higher the CRI, the more accurate it will render the colors in most cases. Now there will be certain cases where a lower CRI will just give the flexibility to add more radiance and change the radiance of the color a little bit. Kind of like the filters when you post a picture on Instagram, you have all these filters that highlight different types of radiance. Well, CRI will do the same thing, but typically in most cases, you're going to want to look for something that's in the 90 plus range CRI. In places like California, again, where it's the law, if it's less than 95 or the 90, then it gets pushed back by the inspector, it gets rejected. But just for performance purposes, if you want to deliver the very best to your clients and make sure that they have a great experience, you want to be paying attention to this. So let's talk about beam spreads now. So the beam spread is extremely important because it'll be the difference in terms of consistency, how evenly a space gets illuminated. If you have a high ceiling and the beam is too wide, then what's going to happen is that light is going to start to dissipate before it actually gets to the surface. And you're going to have sort of a haze in the middle of the room, and you're going to walk in and you're going to say, why does things look kind of hazy in here, kind of glary? Well, it's because your ceiling is too high and your beam is too wide, so the light is dissipating way before it hits the surface, right? But if you have a lower ceiling, let's say an 8-foot ceiling, and your beam is very narrow, that beam doesn't have enough space to travel and dissipate and achieve its widest angle. And so the lights are going to look very spotty on the carpet or on the floor. And you're going to get this feeling like the place is not properly lit, even if you have a bunch of fixtures on the ceiling. So understanding the ratio of ceiling height to beam spread is very important. And again, this is something that the spec sheet will indicate for you. Just as a rule of thumb, as I mentioned before, understand that if you have no optic, the LED has no direction. It'll just go like 120 degrees. It'll just go everywhere. So having the beam is very important. Different manufacturers achieve this in different ways, right? Some will use, you may have seen them, it's like a little silver cone, and that's the one that they use to manipulate the beam. The light emitting from the LED bounces off of that little cone, and it creates the specific angle. And some do it through lenses, and the lens will basically filtrate that light and create the beam for you. So there's different ways that they achieve that. But rule of thumb is that, again, if you have a ceiling that's anywhere in the 8 to 12-foot height, usually a 35-degree to 40-degree beam would be adequate for that space. Some manufacturers don't even really have the degree. They just call it the flood or the narrow flood. So just understand that flood in most cases refers to that 35 to 40-degree optic. Narrow flood will be more in the 25 to 30 degree, a little bit narrower. And again, if you have a very high ceiling, you do want to get a narrower beam, because by the time it travels through all that space and it gets to the areas that it wants to illuminate, it'll be a little bit wider. But if it's too wide, then it's going to create that haze. So these are things that if you happen to engage with us, we'll walk you through them. We also have software that basically measures the intensity of the light. It will even be able to generate a 3D rendering of the space so that you can see how the light behaves, the coverage, the consistency of illumination, so that you don't get any surprises when it comes to doing your walkthroughs and actually turning the lights on. So these are all the types of things where having a lighting designer would be very feasible, especially in cases where it's high end and there's a lot of dollars involved. You want to make sure that you get that right with a minimal amount of effort and labor. So those are the things with beam angles that you want to keep in mind. And again, just going back, keep in mind that how that light is recessed into the fixture, if it's adjustable, how it angles and all that will have an impact on the lumen output. It will have an impact on how that beam behaves. Again, these are things that you need to be thinking about when you're recommending recessed lighting. And then, of course, we have the LED drivers. This is a typical wiring diagram of how you would control a light. You may or may not have a dimmer switch. It may all be done through a software user interface. But understand, again, that not all drivers are created equal. Now, the driver is the go-between the line voltage and the light engine. And the driver is obviously there to make sure that the light engine gets the right amount of milliamps of amperage and the right amount of wattage for optimal performance. Just like it works just like a transformer, right? But except it's a miniature one. But understand that different drivers do different things depending on the protocol. Some drivers could have a tri-mode in them, meaning that they can handle ELV, TRIAC, and maybe even 0 to 10. Some of them are just strictly ELV. And again, the components, not all drivers are created equal. Some manufacturers will test against a specific list of dimmers, and they're usually pretty good about listing those on the spec sheet. So you want to pay attention to that, because if you use one of the dimmers that is not one that they have tested against, you may get some dimming issues, you may get some flickering issues, and you want to be cognizant of those little details. In other cases too, some drivers will tell you that they do 10% dimming. They might not, you know, depending on the quality and the brand. So you do want to pay attention to all of those things. Obviously, Lutron, which is the one that we're featuring here, is the standard by which most of these performances and drivers and specs are measured. So you're always going to be safe going with Lutron. But some manufacturers, if you happen to choose a different one, may use a different brand of driver. The other thing that you want to take into consideration too is that drivers don't last forever, and from time to time they need to be replaced. So where that driver is located inside the housing in relation to your access to it, whether it's through the opening and how far you're going to have to fish into the housing to get to that driver, could be important to you, or just important in general, in case you have to replace it or rewire something. You know, there's like a whole bunch of different scenarios where that could be an issue. So you want to make sure that the driver is readily available and access to the housing, right? In some cases, you may want to have a remote driver, a driver that is not inside the housing. So you're running line voltage to the location where the driver is, and from the driver to the fixture, you're running a low voltage wire, class 2 wiring to power the fixture. There's advantages to both. I can tell you, recently I was working in a project where the owner, this was a house in Venice, California, where the owner was spending $1 million on resurfacing his ceiling with Italian plaster, right? Venetian plaster is what they call it, actually. Very delicate, very labor intensive. Everything was going to be done by hand by an artisan that he was even flying the guy from somewhere in Europe and all this stuff. $1 million to do that, right? So he wanted to make sure once the case to minimize the risk of having to change something and ruining the finish, which I think this guy was only going to be able to do it once, they decided to put remote drivers so that if anything went wrong with the electronics, they could do it without having to mess with the installation or the light itself. So different scenarios, those are some of the things that you want to think about. And the other thing about remote drivers is just make sure that it matches the spec on the LED in terms of voltage and milliamperage and all that other stuff. But typically, most of your lights are going to be line voltage. You just bring in line voltage in, and that's it. Compatibility, again, depends on the manufacturer, depends on what they have tested against. If it's a non-Lutron driver, and those are things that you're going to be wanting to pay attention to. The protocol of the driver is obviously very important. 0 to 10, again, ELV, TRIAC, all those things have to be taken into consideration. Or if you have other systems that you work with, like Dolly, for instance, you want to make sure that there's compatibility there as well. And again, with regards to dimming, keep in mind that the intensity of the light, the lumen output of the light, 1200, 1500 lumens, will have a little bit of an impact on the dimming, right? And also, you need to explain to your clients that when it says 1% dimming or 0.1% dimming, it's not what the eye perceives, but it's based on the spec, on the luminance capability of the light itself, okay, according to the ratio of dimming to the lumen output. And that sometimes takes some people by surprise, because they think that 1% under any circumstance will be barely visible, but that is not the case, right? 1% dimming on an LED will be perceived by the eye as maybe 10, 15%. And let's make sure that we explain that and we set the expectations for our clients. And again, the quality of the dimming, if you want that really smooth dimming, all of those things will be dictated by the protocol, and they will be dictated by the type of driver and the type of control system. So all those things have to come together. And in the second part of the series, we'll be talking about those things a little bit more. So did we have, was there another question, Zach? I can't remember. I think that was it, right? Just those two questions.
Yeah, those were just the only polls that we had.
Yeah. Okay. So using architectural lighting throughout the space. Hopefully this this little session that we've had has given you an appreciation how you can layer, how you can utilize the different platforms, aesthetics and finishes, and manipulate your lights in such a way that just recessed lighting alone could be enough to not only provide general lighting, but be able to accentuate and give a space the correct right and look and feel depending on the intent and the goals of the people that are going to be interacting with that space. This is a good example of how we can achieve all of that in a very uniform way. Okay, so if you want to have a recording of this presentation, you can request it, but it would be good to just review these bullet points on your own when you have some time. You can take a screenshot, whatever the case is, but this is just a summary of things that we want to take away with recessed architectural lighting in general. And now I think we're going to go ahead and open it up for any questions that you might have. And Zach, we're going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks again, Joe. We had a couple questions come in, but they had to do with logistics, people having trouble with audio. Somebody asked if this presentation would be available, if they'd be able to get a copy of the slide deck. I didn't know if that would be okay with you, or if they had a PDF non-editable copy, or if you wanted them to just refer to the recording of the webinar.
Yeah, we can make a PDF available. I think if we do the PowerPoint deck, people have different versions of PowerPoint. Some people may be using Keynote from Mac, and it just kind of jumbles up the configuration. So we'll just go ahead and create a PDF, and we'll send it by request.
Okay, excellent. We'll just leave it open for another minute or two for questions. Everybody else, we're finished. Thanks so much for coming. Be sure to register for sessions 2 and sessions 3. We're going to be doing these every other week, Tuesday and Thursday from 1 to 2 p.m. Well, I think that's it, Joe. I'm just double checking the questions one more time. We got a couple thank yous coming in. So thanks again, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.